The Vorath Galactic Empire had conquered 17 species across 4 spiral arms of the galaxy. They had crushed civilizations that existed for millions of years before the Vorath even learned to make fire. They had burned worlds and enslaved billions of beings across thousands of star systems. No species had ever successfully resisted them for more than a single rotation of their home planet around its star. The Vorath believed they were the strongest beings in the universe, and the universe had given them no reason to think otherwise? Hi, Commander. Zyrvax stood aboard his flagship called the Dominion's Fist and looked at the main viewing screen with cold amusement. Before him floated a small blue and green world that the local inhabitants called Earth. It was a pretty world, he supposed. Blue oceans and white clouds and patches of green and brown land. It would make a fine addition to the Empire. The inhabitants would make adequate workers in the mining colonies. His intelligence officers had spent 3 cycles studying these creatures called humans. The reports made him laugh out loud when he first read them. These soft pink beings required oxygen to breathe and water to survive. They could not see in the dark without artificial help. They could not survive temperatures that any Vorath child would consider mild. Their bodies broke easily and healed slowly. A fall from a small height could shatter their bones. A small wound could become infected and kill them. They lived for barely 100 cycles before dying of simple age. They were fragile in every way that mattered. Their technology was equally disappointing. The humans had basic fusion reactors that operated at laughable efficiency levels. Their weapons were simple kinetic projectiles and primitive plasma systems that the Vorath had stopped using centuries ago. Their ships moved at speeds that the Vorath considered slow, even for civilian transport vessels. Their defensive shields could barely stop a standard Varay assault round. Everything about them screamed weakness. Zyrvax decided to give them a chance to surrender. It was not mercy that motivated him. He simply wanted workers, and dead workers were useless. He recorded the transmission himself. His words were simple and clear. Surrender your world and your colonies. Accept Vorath rule without resistance. Provide workers for our mining operations across the Empire. Do this, and you will be allowed to live and serve. Refuse and face complete destruction of your species. He gave them 1 standard cycle to respond, and then he waited. On Earth, the transmission arrived during the morning hours in North America. Captain Ryan Cole received it aboard the United Earth defense vessel called Horizon, as his ship patrolled the outer edges of the solar system. He was a tall man with gray eyes and steady hands that never shook even under pressure. He had served in the fleet for 20 years and had trained for this moment his entire career. Every drill and every simulation had prepared him for the day when hostile aliens would threaten Earth. He had hoped it would never come. But he had always known it would. He forwarded the message to Earth Command immediately and waited for instructions. His crew watched him with nervous eyes. They were young men and women who had joined the fleet for adventure and steady pay. None of them had expected to face actual war. None of them had expected to possibly die in the cold darkness of space. But they trusted their captain and they would follow his orders. Admiral. Katie Vance was drinking her morning coffee in her office when the priority alert came through. She was a woman in her 60s, with white hair cut short and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. She had helped build the United Earth's defense. Forced from nothing after humanity first made contact with alien life 30 years ago. Back then, humans had been excited and terrified in equal measure. Excited to learn they were not alone in the universe. Terrified to learn that the universe was full of beings far more powerful than them. She had always known this day would come. She had warned every politician and every general who would listen. Humanity needed to be ready. Humanity needed to be strong. But she had also known that humanity needed to be careful. The galaxy was watching, and the galaxy was nervous about these violent newcomers from a small blue world. The Emergency Council gathered within hours in a secure chamber deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. Presidents and prime ministers attended through secure video links. Generals and admirals sat at the long table with grim faces. Scientists who understood alien technology better than anyone provided analysis and projections. They watched the Vorath transmission together on a massive screen. They studied the intelligence reports on Vorath military strength. The numbers were not good. Humanity had 42 combat-capable ships spread across the solar system. The Vorath had brought over 800 warships to this sector alone. And that was just the first wave. Admiral Vance presented the options in her calm, steady voice. They could surrender and hope for mercy from a species that had never shown any to conquered peoples. Historical records showed that Vorath slaves lived short, brutal lives in mining colonies across the Empire. They could fight with everything they had and likely be destroyed within days. Or they could respond under Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was a doctrine that humanity had created when they first joined the galactic community 3 decades ago. It was a promise written into the treaty that allowed humans to participate in galactic civilization. Humanity would always respond with proportional force in any conflict. They would never escalate beyond what their enemy used first. They would never unleash the terrible weapons that had nearly destroyed their own world in centuries past. They would show the galaxy that humans could be trusted. Despite their violent history, many species had been nervous about humanity joining galactic civilization. They had read human history. They had seen what humans did to each other in their wars. They had learned about nuclear weapons and biological warfare and chemical attacks. Protocol 7 was meant to ease those fears. It was meant to show that humanity had grown beyond its violent past. The vote was unanimous after 3 hours of debate. Humanity would fight, but they would fight with restraint. They would use conventional weapons only. They would match Vorath aggression exactly, but never exceed it. They would show the galaxy that humans were civilized beings, who followed rules even in war. The response was sent to the Vorath flagship. Earth would not surrender. Earth would defend itself. Earth would fight. High Commander Zyrvox received the human refusal with something close to delight. He had hoped they would choose to fight. Conquest was so much more satisfying when the prey resisted. It proved Vorath's superiority when lesser species struggled and failed. He ordered his fleet to advance and expected the battle to last perhaps an hour at most. The first engagement happened in the space between Mars and Jupiter. Captain Ryan Cole led a squadron of 12 human vessels against a Vorath force of 60 warships. His ship, the Horizon, was old but reliable. His crew was well trained, but had never faced actual combat against a real enemy. His weapons were basic railguns that fired metal slugs at incredible speed and plasma cannons that burned with blue fire. The battle lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of fire and death in the cold void of space. 19 human ships were destroyed. Their crews died in explosions or in the slow cold of vacuum when their hulls were breached. But when the shooting stopped, the Vorath had lost 31 vessels. Zyrvox studied the battle reports with a new expression. It was not fear, but it was surprise. These fragile creatures had fought harder than expected. He ordered a second wave. This time, he tripled the assault force. There would be no more surprises. The second wave came 3 days after the first battle. 240 Vorath warships moved through the darkness of space toward the inner planets of the human solar system. Their commanders were confident, but also cautious. The first battle had taught them that humans would not break easily. These strange, soft creatures would fight until they died. That made them dangerous, but it did not make them strong enough to win. Lieutenant Danny Marsh piloted his interceptor through the chaos of the second battle. He was 26 years old, with brown hair and green eyes that stayed focused on his screens. Even as death exploded all around him, his small ship darted between larger vessels, firing quick bursts at Vorath fighters whenever they came into range. He had been flying for only 2 years, but he flew like he had been born in the cockpit. The battle raged over Mars, where human colonies held millions of people. Mining stations and research facilities and small cities dotted the red surface of the planet. If the Vorath broke through, they would bomb those colonies into dust. Every human pilot knew this. Every human pilot fought with desperate determination to prevent it. Danny watched 3 of his squadron mates die in the first hour. Their ships exploded into bright flowers of fire that faded quickly in the vacuum. He did not have time to mourn. He did not have time to feel anything except the cold focus of combat. He fired and dodged and fired again. His ship took hits that cracked his hull, damaged his engines, but he kept fighting. The human fleet followed Protocol 7 perfectly. They matched Vorath firepower exactly. When the Vorath used standard plasma weapons, the humans responded with standard plasma weapons. When the Vorath deployed boarding parties, the humans deployed boarding parties. Everything was measured and proportional, just as the doctrine demanded. Admiral Katie Vance watched the battle from Earth Command with hands clasped behind her back. Her face showed nothing, but inside she felt sick. She was watching her people die. She was watching young men and women sacrifice themselves to buy time for a planet that might not survive anyway. And she knew that her ships could do more. She knew they were holding back. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, the human fleet had lost another 14 ships. The Vorath had lost 53. It was a victory of sorts. The Vorath had been pushed back. Mars was safe for now, but everyone knew it was only temporary. The Vorath had thousands more ships. Humanity did not. On the other side of the galaxy, Ambassador Laura Chen stood before the Galactic Council and requested intervention. She was a small woman with black hair and a voice that carried authority despite her size. She had spent her career building relationships with alien species. She had learned their languages and their customs and their fears. Now she called upon those relationships to save her world. The council chamber was vast and filled with representatives from dozens of species. Some were tall and thin with pale skin. Others were short and covered in scales or fur or feathers. They came from worlds scattered across the galaxy, and they all watched the human ambassador with mixed expressions. The Vorath representative rose to respond. He was a massive creature with gray skin and 4 arms and eyes that glowed with cruel amusement. He dismissed the human request with contempt. The Vorath Empire was within its rights to expand. Humanity had refused a generous offer of peaceful integration. Whatever happened next was their own fault. He boasted that the human species would fall within one solar cycle, and their worlds would become productive additions to the Empire. The other representatives stayed silent. They were afraid. The Vorath had conquered many of their allies over the centuries. No one wanted to draw Vorath attention by supporting humans. Laura Chen returned to Earth with nothing but sympathy and empty promises. Meanwhile, Vorath intelligence officer Tarinuk was becoming obsessed with understanding humanity. He was unusual for his species. Where most Vorath saw only strength and weakness, he saw patterns and mysteries. The humans puzzled him. They fought like beings who expected to win, even though every calculation said they should lose. There was something wrong with the picture, and he needed to understand what it is. He intercepted human communications and analyzed them carefully. Most were routine military messages about ship positions and supply lines, but some contained references that made no sense. There were mentions of something called the Omega Arsenal that was classified at the highest levels. There were discussions of biological limiters and adrenaline protocols being kept inactive. There were medical reports about soldiers being cleared for full physical capacity, but ordered to maintain standard output only. Tyranek reported his findings to High Commander Zyrvex. The commander listened with growing impatience. He did not care about mysterious references in human communications. He cared about winning the war. He dismissed the intelligence officer with a wave of his 4 arms and ordered another, salt prepared. But Tyranek could not let it go. He dug deeper into captured human databases. He found training manuals that described combat techniques but noted that certain methods were restricted under Protocol 7. He found medical files that showed humans were capable of physical outputs far beyond what they demonstrated in battle. He found weapons specifications for systems that did not match anything the humans had used against the Vorath. The third battle occurred near the moons of Jupiter. It was the largest engagement yet, with human forces desperately defending the gas giants' orbital stations. Lieutenant Nicole Webb flew her fighter with the same desperate courage as every other human pilot. She had red hair and blue eyes and a husband waiting for her on Earth. She wanted to survive. She wanted to go home. A Vorath missile caught her ship in the engine section. The explosion sent her spinning through space in a damaged craft that was slowly losing air. She managed to activate her distress beacon before a Vorith boarding vessel captured her. They brought her to a detention facility on one of their warships. The interrogation began immediately. The Voroth wanted tactical information about human fleet positions and defensive plans. Nicole refused to talk. They used pain and drugs and threats, but she remained calm through all of it. Her composure disturbed her captors. She should have been terrified. She should have been begging for mercy. Instead, she sat in her cell with steady eyes and an expression that almost looked like pity. One of the interrogators finally asked her the question that Tyrannik had been wondering about. What were humanity's strongest weapons? What were they holding back? Nicole looked at him for a long moment before answering. You really do not want to find out. The interrogator struck her across the face. She took the blow without flinching, and then she smiled. It was a small, sad smile, like a parent watching a child make a terrible mistake. Tyrannik watched the recording of the interrogation later. He watched it many times. Each time he felt a cold sensation spreading through his body. It was a feeling he had never experienced before in his long career. It took him several days to identify it. The feeling was fear. He began to dig into the oldest records he could find. The archives that contained information about Earth from before humanity joined the galactic community. What he found there would change everything. Tyrannik spent 14 cycles locked in his quarters, studying the ancient records. He did not eat properly. He did not sleep properly. He could not stop reading. The information he found painted a picture so disturbing that he sometimes had to stop and remind himself to breathe. The galactic archives contained historical data from every species that had ever joined the interstellar community. When humanity made first contact 30 years ago, they had uploaded their own records as a gesture of good faith. Most species had glanced at human history and moved on. A young civilization from a small planet, nothing special. Nothing worth detailed study. Tyrannik was the first Vorith to read those records carefully. He wished he had remained ignorant. Human history was a catalog of violence unlike anything he had ever encountered. These soft, fragile creatures had spent their entire existence trying to destroy each other. They had fought wars over land and resources and religion and ideas. They had killed millions of their own kind in conflicts that lasted years or decades. They had developed weapons specifically designed to cause maximum suffering to other humans. Records describe something called the First World War. Humans had dug trenches in the ground and slaughtered each other with machines that fired metal, projectiles faster than any being could dodge. They had used chemical weapons that burned lungs and melted skin. They had sent millions of young humans to die in mud and blood for a few kilometers of territory. The casualty figures made Tyrannik physically ill. More humans died in 4 years than the entire population of most Vorath colony worlds. Then came something called the Second World War. It was worse. Humans had refined their killing methods. They had built factories specifically designed to murder millions of their own people. They had burned entire cities with fire dropped from the sky. And at the end, they had created something that changed everything. Nuclear weapons, Tyrannik read. Descriptions with growing horror. Humans had learned to split atoms and release the energy that held matter together. They had built bombs that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light brighter than their sun. They had created radiation that poisoned land and water and air for generations. And they had used these weapons on each other. Twice, the images from places called Hiroshima and Nagasaki haunted his sleep. Shadows of humans burned permanently into stone walls. Buildings flattened for kilometers in every direction. People dying slowly from invisible poison that destroyed their bodies from within. Humans had done this to themselves, not to alien enemies. To their own species. After those bombs fell, humans built more of them. Thousands more. Enough to destroy their entire planet many times over. They pointed these weapons at each other for decades. They came close to using them several times. Only luck and the courage of a few individuals prevented total annihilation, and that was not the worst of it. Tyrannik found records of biological weapons programs. Humans had engineered diseases capable of killing millions. They had created viruses and bacteria designed to spread quickly and kill slowly. They had developed toxins that could poison water supplies for entire regions. Some of these programs were still classified. The records hinted at horrors that even the archives did not fully document. Then he found the medical research. Human bodies were more complex than any Vorath had realized. They had a biological mechanism called the fight-or-flight response. Under extreme stress, their bodies released chemicals that enhanced their physical capabilities dramatically. Their muscles could exert force far beyond normal limits. Their pain tolerance increased to incredible levels. Their reflexes sharpened. Their minds focused with terrifying intensity. Vorath soldiers required synthetic drugs to achieve similar effects. Humans produced these substances naturally. Their bodies were designed for combat at a fundamental biological level. The records showed examples. Humans lifting vehicles that weighed thousands of kilograms to save trapped companions. Humans continuing to fight with wounds that would kill any Vorath warrior instantly. Humans running incredible distances or surviving extreme temperatures through sheer biological determination. Their bodies could push past normal limits in ways that seemed impossible, and they had been suppressing these abilities. Taranok found the Protocol 7 documentation. It was not just about weapons and tactics. It included biological restrictions. Human soldiers in the current war were under orders to use only 80% of their physical capacity. They were taking medications that dulled their natural combat responses. They were deliberately fighting at reduced effectiveness to avoid alarming their galactic neighbors. The weapon systems were even more disturbing. The railguns and plasma cannons the humans used against the Vorath were obsolete by Earth standards. They were museum pieces. Training weapons. The humans had developed antimatter warheads capable of cracking moons. They had gravitic pulse generators that could collapse ships into points of infinite density. They had nanoscale weapons that could disassemble matter at the atomic level. They had things called Hellfire missiles that created miniature stars. None of these weapons had been deployed. None of them had even been mentioned. The humans were fighting an existential war with one hand tied behind their backs because they had promised to be civilized. Taranok requested an emergency meeting with the Vorath War Council. He was not a high-ranking officer. He was just an intelligence analyst. But what he had found was too important to wait for proper channels. High Commander Zyrvex listened to the presentation with visible skepticism. The other council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Taranok showed them the images from human history. He displayed the weapon specifications. He explained the biological capabilities that humans were suppressing. Zyrvex demanded proof. Records could be faked. Humans might be trying to frighten the Vorath with exaggerated claims. Taranok showed them combat footage captured from destroyed human ships. He slowed the recordings and analyzed human pilot performance. He showed how their reaction times were artificially slowed. He demonstrated that their ships were operating at reduced capacity. He presented medical scans of captured humans showing the drugs in their systems. Designed to suppress their natural abilities, the council chamber fell silent. One of the generals asked the obvious question: why would any species deliberately limit itself in a war for survival? Taranok had an answer. Because they knew what they were capable of. Because they were more afraid of themselves than they were of the Vorath. Because they had almost destroyed their own world with their violence, and they had sworn never to unleash it again, unless they had no other choice. The Vorath had been pushing humanity toward that choice. Every battle brought them closer to the moment when humans would decide that civilization was less important than survival. Hi, Commander Zyrvex sat in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. He ordered the largest assault in Vorath history. 2,000 warships would strike Earth directly. They would end this war before humanity could decide to stop holding back. They would crush the humans so quickly and completely that there would be no time for escalation. Taranok wanted to object. He wanted to suggest retreat. But he was just an intelligence officer, and the decision had been made. The fleet began to move toward Earth. toward whatever was waiting for them there. The sky above Earth darkened with enemy ships. 2,000 Vorith warships emerged from faster-than-light travel and spread across the orbital space. Around humanity's homeworld, like a blanket of death, they blocked the sun over entire continents. Their shadows fell across cities and farms and forests. 7 billion humans looked up and saw the end of everything they had ever known. President Sam Harrison stood in the Situation Room beneath the White House and watched the tactical displays with tired eyes. He was 54 years old with gray hair and the weight of his entire species on his shoulders. He had not slept in 3 days. He had not seen his family in weeks. He had spent every waking moment trying to find a way to save humanity through diplomacy, or strategy, or luck. There was no more time for any of those things. The Vorith fleet was the largest military force ever assembled against a single planet. The remaining human ships numbered less than 20. The math was simple. This was the end. Unless something changed. Admiral Katie Vance stood beside the president with a tablet in her hands. On the screen was a single document: authorization to suspend Protocol 7. 2 signatures were required: the president and the senior military commander. Once signed, humanity would be free to defend itself without restriction, free to use weapons that had been locked away for 30 years, free to become what they had once been. The president looked at the document for a long time. He thought about his daughter, who was 12 years old and afraid. He thought about the billions of people counting on him to make the right choice. He thought about the promise humanity had made to the galaxy. The promise to be better than their history. The promise to never again become the monsters they had been. Then he thought about the Vorith ships in orbit. He thought about what would happen to his daughter and every other child on Earth if those ships won. He signed the document. Admiral Vance signed beneath him. Protocol 7 was suspended. The message went out to every human ship, and every human soldier, and every human installation across the solar system. 5 simple words that changed everything. All restrictions are lifted, Commander. Beth Morgan received the order aboard the carrier Retribution. She was 42 years old with short black hair and scars on her hands from 20 years of military service. She had trained her whole life for this moment. She had prayed it would never come. Now it was here, and she had a job to do. She authorized the activation of the Omega arsenal deep in the Retribution's hull. Weapon systems that had been dormant since before Beth was born came online. Power flowed through circuits that had never been used in combat. Targeting computers calculated trajectories for weapons that existed only in classified files. The ship itself seemed to wake up, to become something more than it had been. Across the human fleet, the same thing was happening. Ships that had seemed slow and primitive suddenly accelerated at speeds that should have torn them apart. Their engines had always been capable of more. Now they were unleashed. Human pilots who had been fighting at 80% capacity stopped taking their suppression medications. Their bodies flooded with natural combat chemicals. Their reaction times dropped to levels that Vorith computers could barely track. The Vorith detected the changes immediately. Their sensors registered massive energy surges from human vessels. Power readings that made no sense. Ships moving in ways that violated what they thought they knew about human technology. High Commander Zyrvex ordered his fleet to attack before the humans could fully power up their new systems. He was too late. The first antimatter torpedo launched from the Retribution. It was a small device, no larger than a human torso. It contained enough destructive force to crack a moon. It crossed the distance to the nearest Vorath battleship in less than a second and detonated. Against its hull, the explosion was visible from Earth's surface. A flash of white light brighter than the sun. When it faded, there was nothing left of the Vorath battleship. Nothing left of the 3 ships that had been flying beside it. Just expanding clouds of atoms and radiation. More torpedoes followed. Human ships that had been outnumbered and outgunned suddenly became dealers of death on a scale the Vorith had never imagined. Antimatter warheads erased vessels from existence. Gravitic pulse cannons fired beams that collapsed enemy ships into dense spheres of crushed metal and flesh. The Vorath had no defense against weapons that bent space itself. Commander Beth Morgan watched her displays and felt nothing. There was no joy in this, no satisfaction, only the cold efficiency of survival. She gave orders, and her crew followed them, and Vorath ships died by the dozens. The human fighters deployed next. Small ships piloted by men and women who were no longer holding back. Lieutenant Danny Marsh felt the change in his own body as the suppression drugs wore off. His heart pounded. His vision sharpened. His hands moved on the controls with speed and precision that felt superhuman, because it was. This was what human bodies could do when they stopped pretending to be normal. He flew his interceptor through a formation of Vorath fighters and destroyed 6 of them in 8 seconds. His ship moved in patterns that should have been impossible, turns that should have crushed him with acceleration, maneuvers that no Vorath pilot could track or predict. He was not fighting like a soldier. He was fighting like what humans had always been underneath their civilized surface: a predator. The Vorath fleet began to panic, their communications filled with screaming and confusion. Ships that had conquered 17 species were being torn apart by creatures they had dismissed as weak and primitive. Their commanders tried to organize retreats, but there was nowhere to run. Human ships were faster now. Human weapons reached further. Human pilots showed no mercy, because mercy was a luxury they could no longer afford. High Commander Zyrvex watched his fleet die from the bridge of his flagship. He had thought he understood war. He had thought he understood strength. He had been wrong. The humans had not been weak. They had been restrained. There was a difference, a terrible, important difference that he was only now beginning to understand. The human carrier Retribution turned its main weapons toward the Dominion's fist. Commander Beth Morgan looked at the tactical display showing the Vorath flagship. She could destroy it with a single shot. She could kill everyone aboard, including the commander who had started this war. She hesitated for just a moment. Not out of mercy. Out of something more practical. A living enemy commander could surrender. A dead one could not. She opened a communication channel. High Commander Zyrvox, your fleet is destroyed. You are surrounded. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the laws of war. Continue fighting, and you will be erased. The Vorath commander looked at his displays. Of 2,000 ships, only 43 remained. The battle had lasted for hours. His entire invasion force was gone. Everything he had built, everything he had conquered. Gone in less time than it took to eat a meal, he gave the order to surrender. The shooting stopped. The void of space was filled with debris and bodies and the wreckage of an empire's pride. Humanity had won. But Commander Beth Morgan felt no victory. She looked at her hands on the control console and wondered if they would ever feel clean again. She had done what was necessary. They all had. But necessary and right were not always the same thing. Earth had survived. The question now was what came next. High Commander Zyrvox surrendered personally to Admiral Katie Vance aboard the human vessel Horizon. The same ship that had fought in the first battle of the war, the same ship that had seemed so primitive and weak when Vorath sensors first scanned it. Now Zyrvex walked through its corridors as a prisoner and understood how badly he had misjudged everything. The surrender ceremony was simple. No grand speeches. No displays of triumph. Admiral Vance stood in the ship's conference room with gray eyes that showed no emotion. Zyrvex signed the documents that ended the war and accepted responsibility for Vorath aggression. His 4 hands trembled as he wrote his name. He who had never trembled before anything in his long life. When the ceremony ended, he asked the Admiral a single question. Why had humanity restrained itself for so long? Why had they fought with primitive weapons and reduced capabilities, when they could have ended the war in the first battle? Admiral Vance was quiet for a moment. Then she told him a story. Humanity had nearly destroyed itself many times. They had built weapons capable of ending all life on their planet, and they had come close to using them. They had fought wars that killed hundreds of millions of their own kind. They had created horrors that still haunted their collective memory. When they finally achieved space travel and met other species, they made a decision. They would never be that version of themselves again, unless they had no other choice. Protocol 7 was not just a diplomatic gesture. It was a promise humanity made to itself. A promise to be better. A promise to prove that they had evolved beyond the violence that defined their history. Every human who served in the military understood this. Every human who fought against the Vorath knew they were holding back. They accepted the risk of death, rather than become what their ancestors had been. Zyrvex asked what had changed. What made humanity finally unleash their true capabilities? Admiral Vance looked at him with something that might have been sadness. You threatened our children. You threatened our home. You gave us no choice but to remember what we are. The Vorath commander was taken to a holding facility to await trial for war crimes. He had plenty of time to think about what he had learned. Time to understand that strength was not always visible. That the most dangerous beings were sometimes the ones who chose not to show their power. Intelligence Officer Tarunik was also taken prisoner. Unlike his commander, he requested meetings with human officials. He wanted to understand them better. He had spent so long studying humanity from a distance. Now he wanted to learn from them directly. General Chris Palmer agreed to speak with him. He was an older man with white hair and kind eyes that had seen too much death. He took Taronik to a place called a museum. A building filled with artifacts from human history. They walked through halls lined with images and objects. Tyrannox saw photographs from human wars. Soldiers in muddy trenches. Cities reduced to rubble. Mass graves filled with bodies. He saw weapons that humans had used against each other. Swords and guns and bombs and things he could not identify. He saw the shadows burned into walls at Hiroshima. The empty shoes of children who had been killed in concentration camps. General Palmer explained each exhibit patiently. He did not hide anything. He did not make excuses. He showed Tarenik exactly what humanity was capable of, and exactly what they had done. Tarenik asked why they kept these terrible memories. Why not destroy the evidence and forget? General Palmer shook his head. We keep them because we must never forget. We must always remember what we can become if we lose control. Every human child learns this history. Every human soldier is taught about these horrors. Not to celebrate them. To fear them. To make sure we never repeat them. The Vorath Empire collapsed within a standard year. News of their defeat spread across the galaxy. Species they had conquered for centuries rose up against them. Their military was broken. Their economy was shattered. Their reputation as invincible conquerors was gone forever. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss what they called the human question. Representatives from every major species gathered in the Great Chamber. Fear hung in the air like smoke. Every being present had heard about what happened to the Vorath fleet. Every being present was wondering if they might be next. Ambassador Matt Cooper addressed the assembly. He was a calm man, with brown hair and a gentle voice that somehow filled the enormous room. He understood the fear in the chamber. He had expected it. He assured the gathered representatives that humanity would return to Protocol 7 immediately. The terrible weapons would go dormant again. Human soldiers would reactivate their biological limiters. Earth sought no empire. Earth wanted no conquest. Earth desired only to live in peace among the stars. But everyone in the chamber understood the unspoken message. Humanity had proven what they could do if pushed too far. They had weapons that made Vorath technology look primitive. They had soldiers who could fight beyond any normal biological limits. They had the will to use these capabilities when their survival was at stake. And they had spent their entire existence fighting the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy themselves. Every species present made a silent vow that day. They would never give humanity a reason to become what they had once been. They would never threaten Earth. They would never harm human colonies. They would treat these strange, soft creatures from the blue planet with respect and caution forever. In the years that followed, humanity became something unexpected in galactic civilization. Not conquerors. Not rulers, peacekeepers. Other species requested human mediators for their conflicts. Human diplomats helped negotiate treaties between ancient enemies. Human soldiers deployed as neutral forces to prevent wars before they started. They were perfect for the role. They understood violence better than any species in the galaxy. They knew what war could become if allowed to escalate. They had experience with the worst possibilities. That knowledge made them value peace more deeply than anyone else. Commander. Beth Morgan retired from military service 5 years after the war. She bought a small farm on Mars and spent her days growing vegetables and watching the stars. Sometimes she thought about the battle over Earth, about the weapons she had fired, about the lives she had ended. She did not regret what she had done. Regret was useless. She had saved her species. She had protected her home. She had done what was necessary. But she carried the weight of it. Every human who fought that day carried the same weight. It was the price of survival. Deep. Beneath the surface of Earth in vaults that few knew existed, the weapons waited. The antimatter warheads. The gravitic pulse generators. The nanoscale disassemblers. The Hellfire missiles. They were maintained by small crews who hoped they would never be needed again. They were checked and tested and kept ready. Just in case, humanity had learned from their history. They had grown beyond their violent past. They had become peacekeepers and diplomats and builders. But they never forgot what they were capable of. They never dismantled the tools of destruction. They kept them hidden and silent and ready, because the galaxy was vast and full of dangers. And somewhere out there, another species might one day make the same mistake the Varath had made. Another empire might look at humanity and see only soft, fragile creatures on a small blue world. Another commander might send a fleet to conquer Earth, thinking it would be easy. If that day ever came, humanity would be ready. They would try diplomacy first. They would try restraint. They would follow Protocol 7 for as long as possible. They would prove